are more than 100 unique styles of beer, each with their own set of ingredients, process, guidelines, history, and experience. If you're a beer lover, an industry leader, or somewhere in between, a better knowledge of beer style will improve your life and your work.
Welcome to A Sense of Beer Style, essential beer style training for those who want to lead in food and beverage. I'm Julia Herz.
And I'm Jeremy Storton.
We're advanced Cicerones, beer judges, home brewers, and we're excited to guide you through the vast and wonderful world of beer styles.
Wow, Saison, for Sense of Beer Style, sobs, not snobs. We are here together. We're here together. We're ready to do it. I'm ready to drink some. I'm ready to talk about some. I've been thinking about Saison all week, and I couldn't be more excited. Jeremy and I will kick this off and say that this is one of those styles that really changed the beer world. This is one of those styles that comes from a very humble place, right? In the kind of French. This is one of those styles that comes from a very humble place in the French-speaking region of Belgium, Wallonia, and we've got farm workers. They need multiple things from their winter. One, they need something to do, right? So they are told to brew. Two, by doing that in the winter, they then have spent grain for feed for livestock. And three, the byproduct of doing that brewing is going to give them beer in the summer when they're hot and they're thirsty. And the essence of this beer style really has a lot of that notion of coming kind of from the farm workers of the region. It traditionally could have malted barley, it could have rye, it could have spelt, it could have wheat. So they were really also using Saison as one of those styles to help them work through whatever was available to them based on how the harvest is going. I also want to say, in testing for Master Cicerone, which I have still yet to get, this was one of those styles, every time I present it blind, unless you're served one of the true classic examples, it would throw me off, right? Saison challenges me because sometimes they can be a little sour. Sometimes they're more wheat-centric. Other times they're more Pilsner malt-centric. Sometimes they're more rustic and rough around the edges. Other times they're more clean and refined. So it is really a style of a lifetime to get to know and to always calibrate and recalibrate on. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and toss it to my colleague, Jeremy, to take you through anything else he wants to add on history, but also talk about ingredients and brewing process.
Yeah, and thank you, Julia. I love that. And this is, I remember, I remember the first time I had a good Saison, and I remember thinking, wait, what? This is. Let me back up. I need to give credit where it's due. Whoever from the BJCP put together this guideline, you made a lot of, or did a lot of hard work and made a lot of difficult choices. This is a beer style that is hard to pin down. This is to describe it is like trying to describe music and trying to put it in a genre, but it defies genre. This is something that I've had 1,000 saisons, and they've all been different. And they've had some commonalities, and we're going to talk about those commonalities, but they've been different. And when we're talking about this, there's another beer style that's not in the BJCP, but it's another beer style nonetheless that we want to discuss because it goes hand in hand with the Saison, and that is the Grisette.
Good job bringing that up. Good job.
Thank you very much. I was prepared. The Grisette is basically a lighter ABV Saison, or as I like to call it, a Saison light. But a Grisette, which was catered more toward the miners historically, by my best knowledge. The Saison would cater more toward the farm workers, but it was essentially the same beer, just a lighter ABV. So keep that in mind. So I'm going to do my best to talk about ingredients, and so if you go out there into the commercial land, and especially in Belgium or France, and try and find a Saison, it's going to be different. So take everything that I say with a grain of salt. But I'm going to speak to the home brewers now. For those of us who like to brew, we're going to start off with the pale base malts because we need that diastatic power to convert all the starches. But the rest of the grist is going to vary. It could have wheat, it could have oats, it could have rye, it could have spelt, it could have corn, it could have whatever you have on hand. You can put that in there. And in the farms, when you had a lot of the stuff on hand, you used what you had. a lot of these saisons are going to be spiced, fruited when we see them out in the market. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the base style saison. So to that extent, spices, adjuncts like sugar, maybe even honey, they do exist. You can put them in there. It's totally allowed by style guidelines, uh, but they're not terribly common because they're not necessary. But they can find their way in there. We are going to look at continental European hops. It could be German style, could be British style, but they are going to take a back seat. They are going to be kind of restrained. Their presence will be felt. You will taste them, you will smell them, but that's not the point. The hops are just there to add to the conversation, not to dominate. What will more so dominate the conversation is that Belgian Saison style yeast. That is going to be just full of esters, full of phenols. We'll talk about the aromas and flavors in just a minute. But I want to make sure we're very clear. When we're talking about a base Saison, many Saisons will be used with a Brettanomyces or Brett, which will give it a funky flavor, maybe a overripe pineapple flavor. For the base style Saison, we're not talking about Brett. If we're talking about a competition style, anything with Brettanomyces is going to go into a wild ale category. So if you're studying this and you're thinking, I just want to know the base style Saison, so let's take Brettanomyces off the conversation table for now. You will find it in many commercial styles, but that's a Saison with Brett as opposed to just being a Saison. I'm sorry, there's a lot of info to absorb and process with this style, but that's how complex this humble rooted style is going to be. So that's the ingredients. Let's talk about the appearance now that you have yours poured.
Yeah, and you have to note if you happen to be watching us on YouTube as opposed to listening, and either's fine. You're not missing out because you can always pour your own or come back and watch us after you've listened. I'm still working to get the collar of foam to collapse enough so I can take a sip without being coated with that foam. It's almost like a slow pour Pilsner where there's the foam stacks, drops, collapses, pour 'em again. And it really is now a stable collar of foam. That's really showing a lot of protein from the whatever was fermented and added, or not even necessarily fermented, but added. And it is also less clear. And the guidelines on appearance, first of all, color wise, pale gold to deep amber. I'm right there in that range. I'm probably at 6 SRM, a little bit darker gold for this Saison DuPont that we're trying. And then that long-lasting, deep, rocky color of foam is right where it needs to be. It talks about the style guidelines, talk about Belgian lace. And then the unfiltered aspect of it is going to allow it to have variable clarity, right? Poor to good. So don't expect it to have to be clear. Even Saison DuPont emphasizes unfiltered Belgian farmhouse ale. And then the last piece aspect of appearance is that effervescence. And my site here, my kind of Tiku tulip, has some nucleation sites at the bottom, which are little pockmarks or divots in the glass that then allow the CO2 to expel and break and open. So that's why I have fast rising bubbles even more aggressively coming from the glass. But you definitely want this beer to be not just have a strong color of foam, but to be effervescent.
Yeah. One of the things I love about that particular beer style and just the way that it develops foam when you pour it well is it reminds me of just really good old school cappuccino foam. I mean, it's dense. It's going to last for a long time. I mean, you can dip cookies in it and just enjoy the foam before you even get to the beer. It's fantastic. When we get to the aroma, when I evaluate my beer, I'm very systematic. I always go to the malt first. That malt, again, this beer could offer you so many different versions, and it's all okay. But to find an average with a sample set of millions, we're looking at a kind of a lighter, grainy malt. We're looking for breadiness, crackers, biscuitiness, maybe light honey, maybe some corn check cereal if they add a little bit of corn to it. There's so many different flavors, or aromas that can come out from this, and so take this beer with an open mind and just receive whatever it has to offer. One word of advice, because they do break it out in the style guidelines. They do break it out between pale versions and darker versions. The flavor or the aroma will correlate to the color. If you see something a little bit darker, then you might expect to smell maybe some caramel. That is completely fine. Let the color be your guide, and you decide if it holds up to what it promises or not. We're also expecting to smell this beautiful low to moderate hops. These beers can have some hop character to them. They can have some hop presence. It's not going to dominate, but it can be balanced with hops. Or if we're talking about aroma, I can't really talk about acidity because we can't smell sourness, but you can get a perception of sourness. I would expect that it's either going to smell like it's going to be bitter and hoppy, or it's going to smell like it's going to be sour. It's usually not both. And if it's bitter, when you taste it, if it's bitter and sour, that's not typical. But it can balance either way, and you're going to get those aromas that suggest one or the other. But it should be in balance. Now let's get into the fermentation. The fermentation is going to offer these beautiful esters. We could have pome fruit, like pears and apples, stone fruit, like plums and apricots. I love it. Sometimes we'll get some tropical flavors come through. Maybe some red berries come through. So I've had some that are just kind of like green wine grapes that come through, almost kind of winey. It's all fair game depending on how it manifests. With those with the what do you call it? The phenols. Thank you very much. The phenols. A lot of that is going to come through peppery, allspice. It shouldn't come across as clove. That's reserved for German Weiss beers. One of the things I smell all the time with and taste all the time with the Saisons is just that white pepper. And if you've never cooked with white pepper, I want you to go to the store after you hear this. I want you to find, it's not very expensive, but find a little container of white pepper. I want you to go home, crack some black pepper, put it in a little plate, and take some of that white pepper. And I want you to taste the difference. And what I expect you'll taste is that white pepper is going to be, it's still peppery. It still has that kind of black pepper flavor and spice to it, but it's creamier. It's softer. And that's what I get from these Saisons. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful thing. Along with that, we can just get this just earthiness. It can be grassy. It can be herbal. It can be floral. It can be spice-like. It can manifest in so many different ways that I could talk for another 5 minutes, but I won't, because I really want to hear, Julia, I want to hear you talk about flavor.
And everything you just said does tie to flavor and then
Yeah.
some. I always say if I had a rock band, I'd call it dichotomy of textures. If I were naming or describing what Saison is about, it's dichotomy of flavors, right? And so flavor has those aromatic compounds,
Yeah.
the basic taste, and then the mouthfeel. And so much of what you just said really applies to what I'm perceiving as I drink this classic example. But let me simplify it for you, just so your brain kind of latches in. You're looking for that dichotomy of fruity esters, phenols, which Jeremy described very well, a sense of hoppy bitterness, because now we're in the flavor zone. You don't smell bitterness. And then your malt, your Belgian Pilsner expression of kind of that grainy Pilsner malt. And then you want a dry finish, right? That's the big picture of Saison in a glass. It's easier to kind of think about the big picture and then dial in to get more descriptive. Hop flavor on top of that, because bitterness is just one aspect of hops. Hop flavor would be low to medium. So you do want to get an essence of these hops that are used, but they're not going to be aggressive. Then on top of that, the attenuation, right? That aspect of how many sugars have been fermented is going to express itself as more aggressive, very high attenuation style beer. The beer itself, though, is not going to display as too bitter, even though there's definitely discerning bitterness. It's not going to display as bone dry. It's also not going to display as residual sugar is high or too sweet. It's kind of this really good balance, and it lands in the sweet spot of what I've just described. On top of that, if they added herbs or spices, you're going to have optional notes of that in the flavor, but it's not expected. And then, as Jeremy was talking about in the aroma, because a lot of people say they can smell the sense of sweet, they can smell the sense of sour. Sure, you can get volatiles that might indicate that, but
Yep.
once you finally get to the taste, that sourness, as Jeremy, you were saying, it's optional, it's not expected, but it could be there. And that sourness is not going to be acetobacter or vinegary. It's more going to be, say, a lactic, light, not aggressive sour, yogurt, more lemonade
Refreshing.
like.
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely
real,
refreshing.
real light essence of that. And then you brought up, Jeremy, which I think is great. And I'm going to kind of side note real quick. If you're entering these into BJCP competition, you're asked by the style guidelines to indicate several things. One is the strength of the Saison. So you're actually going to say if it is table, which means, real sessionable, more everyday drinking, not as heavy, standard or super. You're also asked to express if it's pale or dark. So in the flavor, if this is more of a dark beer, dark versions will going to have more malt character, right? You're going to get an essence from those darker malts. And so that might be something you shouldn't be surprised of. And that stronger versions, more kind of girthy versions in the alcohol range, are going to have more intensity. So those are two things to kind of add on to the aspect of the spectrum of options that you might taste.
Yeah. When we get to mouthfeel, a rule of thumb for most, if not all, Belgian beers, the sours notwithstanding, but the Belgian beers, they tend to be lighter in body, lighter to moderate in body. They tend to be dry in the finish. They tend to be very highly carbonated, and that's by design. This Saison follows that suit. We're looking at a light to medium body. I have never had a full-bodied Saison. And I don't expect to. If someone hands me a Saison and it's full bodied, I'm going to expect that they put lactose or did something funky to it, because that's not how a Saison or a Belgian style beer should manifest. The carbonation in this is very high. A lot of these bottles will be, or a lot of these beers will be bottle conditioned. So that means that they're have a sugar added to them in the bottle so that they continue to ferment, have a secondary fermentation. So therefore, the bottles are going to be thicker. They probably have a cork in it, because like a champagne bottle, because you have pressure built in there. We don't want to turn those bottles into bombs. And that's just a product of building that carbonation that's higher, and just have that wonderful palate cleanser. You can have a light alcohol warming. It depends on the strength. We'll talk about that when we get to the vital stats. And you can have a light acidity. Again, it depends. Are they balancing that beer with a hop presence? Are they balancing that beer with acidity? Most of the balance between the malt is going to be between the malt and the fermentation. But which member of the band is going to step up to toward the front of the stage? Is it going to be the hops or the acidity? But it really shouldn't be both. And you should see that in the mouthfeel. You either get that tannicky grip from the hops, or that kind of pucker of the lips from the acidity. So that's the mouthfeel. Let's get into the style comparison.
I love the two styles that you would want in a flight, tasting all three blind, with Saison as one of the three, and then Belgian Blonde Ale. Listen to our style cast on that from
Mm-hmm.
Sense of Beer Style, Jeremy and I, and then also a Belgian Triple. So the Belgian Blonde is going to be less hoppy and bitter, less attenuated. It's going to be sweeter, meaning, and it's not going to be as strong in the alcohol. That depends on the fact that you're getting actually a standard strength Saison. And then on the other end of the spectrum, compared to a Belgian triple, Saisons are definitely going to be more rustic, right? More malt focused, that is front and center, and more yeast focused. Triples are more nuanced, they're more delicate. And then when you finally go off on triple and Belgian Golden Strong land, that's really two tough ones to try next to each other. But I like a Saison next to a triple, because you should be able to find your way to the Saison, because it just got more going on in terms of complexity and intensity of everything from its yeast and malt notes to to the aspects of what phenols and esters are there. So those are two great styles to try, and have yourself a trio of trying, and you're going to really start to dial in the styles.
Yeah. When we get to commercial examples, these are very easy to find. oftentimes you might see these as a farmhouse ale. So if you see farmhouse, that's pretty interchangeable with the Saison. Or if you see Saison, then that's easy. But a lot of home brewers brew this. A lot of commercial brewers put this. It may be harder to find at your convenience store. It might be harder to find at your grocery store. But if you go to a good bottle shop, they will have some of these there. Some of the styles, or some of the classic styles that we're looking at. And Julia, I'm going to ask you to raise up your can. Saison du Pont is the classic. And quick little story. Throughout my beer nerd sob career, I've had a Saison du Pont out of their green bottle many, many times. And every single time there have been some off flavors or skunkiness or it just didn't age well. Until they finally put it in a can and I got a hold of a can. That was the first time I was able to taste a really a good version of Saison du Pont, and it was everything everyone told me it would be. So if you can, try and find the can, because my personal experience is that's better.
I'm going to jump in real quick, and this is your section, but I'm going to say, drinking this now, my first canned version, the cork and cage version is much more carbonated. It's a different expression of carbonation, right? And those traditionally have the punt in the bottom of the bottle. So I'm going to say try them side by side, and you will definitely notice a mouthfeel difference for sure.
Yeah, interesting. Other examples that we can find. Another one of these that I find in a lot of places, a lot of states I've been, is Boulevard's Brewing's Tank 7. That is another good example of this style. It might be a bit Americanized compared to a Belgian version, but it's still beautiful and still wonderful. But if you want to go back to the home of these, then we need to go back to Belgium. We're looking at Allez Eloy Saison 2000, or Le Feuve Saison 1900, Saison de Pipet, Saison Vousson, or another version. It's not on the guidelines, but has never, ever, ever let me down. You go to a good bottle shop and you find some Fantôme with a cute little ghost on the image. Those have never let me down. Those are beautiful. But those are some commercial examples you can find. Let's get into the vital stats.
It's interesting. BJCP style guidelines mention Fantôme in the history, but they don't put it in the commercial examples.
That's why I decided I want to bring it up, because it needs to stay in there.
And when I've had Fantôme, and I haven't had it in years, but it really blew my mind. That's like tipping the ode to the much more rough around the edges, rustic. I do believe I got an essence of Brettanomyces, if I'm remembering correctly. And so it's more edging itself towards that other version of the style. But yeah, good one to bring up. Yeah. So we'll talk vital stats. This is a little harder to articulate while you're listening and watching, but again, this is all about just getting you aligned so you can kind of have multiple impressions over time to finally memorize the stats. But bear with us, because you've got standard strength, you've got table strength, and you've got super strength, right? And you've got pale and dark. So that's a lot. The style guidelines kind of simplify it. And so we always talk with original gravity. 1048 to 1065 would be standard. And then final gravity for a standard Saison is 10002 to 10008. That is really expressing dry, right? So remember that it's even numbers, 10002 to 10008, and very dry for a standard Saison in the final gravity. And then that brings you to ABV ranges of 3.5 to 5% for table beers, right? Table Saisons. Again, I said those are more sessionable, kind of throwing back more everyday drinking. 5 to 7% for standard, and that's what most of what Jeremy mentioned for the classic styles fall into. And then super would be 7 to 9.5%. I'm going to say those are much more rare. You're really not coming across those as much. And then international bitterness units. This is a style that tends to surprise you in its discerning bitterness. It's 20 to 35. And so 20 is not going to really be as noticeable, but you're getting up to 35 bitterness units with that dry finish. You're really going to start to notice how the hops deliver a balancing aspect to these styles. And then SRM, or standard reference method, 5 to 14 for pale. Wow, what a range, because we talked about, the pale and the dark. 5 is gold, right? You go all the way up to 14. You're literally getting to copper and edging your way towards brown, but not all the way there. And then 15 to 22, definitely dark browns, right? A brown beer. So that's a big range depending on what style or example that you get.
Yeah. For those of you who speak European Brewery Convention, for the pale, we're looking at 10 to 28, dark 30 to 44. But like I said before, it's hard to pin the style down. Kudos to whoever wrote these, because this beer could be anywhere from very, very pale to brown. It's the gamut. When we get into gravities, the gravities Plato, we're looking at 12 to 16 and a half or so. In the final Plato, we're getting it below zero, which is possible if it's alcohol based, but that's a different prep episode. But we're looking at 0 to 2. This can manifest alcohol wise. If you're still speaking Plato, we're looking about 12 to 14 and a half, thereabouts. But when we get into having these beers, these beers come from humble roots. If you're having a Saison, it conjures the farm and the stories of the farm and the flavors of the farm. If you're thinking a grisette, which kind of follows that kind of table strength of Saison, kind of like the 2 to 4% or so, then that conjures the miners, and that's kind of where grisette comes from. Grisette being gray, and so it's probably named after the walls or something like that. I don't know that story. But this beer comes from humble roots, but yet it is so complex and interesting in flavors, and is so food pairable that I really need to put this in a proper glass. My favorite glass to drink out of, period, but especially this style, is my stemmed tulip, and it's the logo. It's the glass on our logo. That's the glass that this beer really should be in, because we want to hold that foam up. We want to volatilize those aromas and focus them into my nose. If it's on the paler side and I want it to be a little bit colder, if it's hot outside, I want it to be a little bit colder, then I can hold that by the stem. If it's a darker version and maybe a little bit cooler, cooler outside, maybe I warm it in my hand by holding it in the bowl of the glass. But these ought to be in a stem tulip, maybe a goblet, and or a good pint glass like a Willie Becker. But I'm going to beg you, please don't ever put these in a shaker pint or a red party cup. This beer deserves a little bit more. Let's talk about pairing.
So pairing, this beer could and should go with foods of the country of origin, right? In Belgium, mussels comes up a lot, right? I mean, you just have these beers that are not as the alcohol strength of wine. They are dry, so they're refreshing and quenching. They've got some coarse, more coarse bitterness, so they can stand up to richer or fatty foods. So I do go to seafood if you're a pescatarian, and so mussels, right, with frites is great. You're going to have synergy from the fries that fall into that Belgian Pilsner malt. I bring up a lot, I guess this really influenced me as a dish, Jeremy, seared scallops with mustard sauce. And I still get that in this style. I brought it up in multiple other shows where we probably had wheat-based beers. But I love the idea of some seared scallops, which scallops, if they're cooked properly, are not gamey and too fishy. And that sear aspect, I think, would bring almost like a little bit of caramelized melanoidins to the beer and almost maybe take you towards that dark Saison ode. And so that's what I want to have it with. And then maybe serve those scallops over some kind of just buttered fettuccine type of pasta, and you have yourself a meal.
Yeah, and it's hard because you could have pale, hoppy versions. You could have pale, more tart versions. You could have darker versions that have those melanoidin flavors, and it's all wonderful. So try it with anything and everything. I've had tremendous success pairing this with grilled vegetables, especially over a fire, because it conjures that rusticness. Maybe some like rustic Italian bread, some lighter meats like chicken, or you mentioned the seared scallops, maybe a creamy mushroom pasta. I've had this with salmon. It's fantastic. One of my favorite things to do when I want to treat myself is I'll get this beautiful ahi tuna and I'll just sear it lightly with olive oil, salt, and pepper, smother the top with Dijon mustard, and crumble some crushed pistachios over the top. This beer is amazing with that. And I save that for my birthday. Goat cheese, many cheeses, funky cheeses. This opens up so many flavor doors that I have I really haven't found a bad pairing with this beer yet. So, truth is, if I need a slam dunk pairing and without thinking too much about it, I just grab a Saison and figure out the rest, to be honest.
It's great. Great. Hungry and thirsty as always. Good stuff.
Well, so go out and find a Saison. Go out, brew your own Saison. And if you haven't experienced a Saison before, or even if you're not quite sold on the whole Saison thing, try others, because there's so much variability here that I'm sure you'll find one that you love. But until then, cheers.
Enjoy.
Thank you for listening to A Sense of Beer Style, the essential beer style training for those who want to lead in food and beverage. With advanced Cicerones, me, Julia,
and me, Jeremy.
Tune into the next episode as we continue exploring the world of beer styles and what to make of them. We encourage you to listen to the prepisodes to build your foundation and better understand beer styles.
And before the next episode, I'd like to ask you to review the show and let us know what you'd like featured in upcoming episodes. Until next time, here's to you and your sense of beer style. Thank you for listening. Cheers.